People who are/have been homeless. What was the first night without a home like, and how did you adapt to your new situation? I didn't really realize what was going on. I was about 6 or 7 at the time. Dad said we were going to go for a drive and to pack my backpack with all the clothes I could fit and one toy. Mom was just crying. Me and my brother sat in the back seat. He was a little older and was holding our Sega Genesis and looked scared. We drove for a little while, it was already getting dark, and we parked in front of a Walmart. Dad said he had to rest for a while. That was the first of many nights we slept in the car. I remember one of my parents was always awake, with their hand in their coat pocket. Looking back, it was obvious they had a gun for protection, sleeping in shifts. The first one being from the perspective of a child is rough. OP, it sounds like your parents really did their best to make what they could out of a garbage situation. I don't know what led to you losing the home or whatever, but at this point I can only hope that you're housed and happy and well. Story 2. I was homeless for a couple of months a year or two ago. I had a car and a low-paying job, so I lived in the woods in a tent for a bit. The first night was miserable. I ended up sleeping really uncomfortably in the passenger seat of my car, and it was a really cold night. After that, I got a tent and slept on an old climbing pad I had. The first night was hell, but the next several weeks were actually not so bad. I had a spot in the woods where I was well hidden and could cook over a fire. I really didn't have it that bad, but it gave me quite a bit of sympathy for people who really do end up on the streets in a much more desperate situation. It is not easy. Story 3. First night my wife and I ended up sleeping outside. We slept in a local park that I knew. We had come down from the countryside with a few rands, enough for one meal maybe, and had hoped to stay with a friend. He was unable to give us a place to stay, so we had to sleep outside. After the insecurity of that first night, I told my wife that we had to find a safer place to sleep. So we climbed up the slopes of Table Mountain, about a 1-hour walk, and found quite an obscure spot amongst some bushes and trees. We cleared out sticks and rocks, made it a bit more habitable, and then went back to the city looking for work. We'd spend the day going from one place to the next looking for jobs until it started going dark. Then we would head up to the mountain to our little spot for the night. Did that daily for a month until we were able to secure a small shack room in the townships, where we stayed for another few months until I got a job offer. It was my wife's temp waitering jobs that kept us fed while I was looking for work. Biggest challenge was mental, keeping focused, clean, looking presentable, and just making my job looking for a job. Story 4. When I was a teenager, I had a lot of problems with my mom. I pretty much chose to be homeless. I slept at a Catholic church across from my high school so I could still make it to school and graduate early. I remember feeling really sad because I slept where they put people's ashes. And I remember being so sad that those people could comfort me more in death than anyone could alive. I used to talk to them. If there's camera footage, I look insane. I never realized how alone in this world I was until I was homeless. I never realized how cold concrete can be. It chills you right to your bones and is painful. Story 5. Sleeping in my car wasn't that bad. It was summer, so it was pretty warm, which was my biggest issue. Showered in the gym and spent most of my day at the library before going to work. For the first few nights, it wasn't bad. However, one night, police found me sleeping in my car and escorted me to the local homeless shelter, which was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I'm lying there in a top bunk when a huge argument breaks out because one guy breaks out some drugs and wouldn't share it with a second. Then a third got upset and started screaming at them to be quiet because he needed to sleep. Story 6. I became homeless at 19. A previous foster parent put me out for coming home from college one night, and I'd called up a friend last minute. When I started to realize I wouldn't be able to crash or stay anywhere, I'm fairly certain I started to dread and spiral into a constant, underlying depressive state. All I could think about was, am I going to die like this? Do I matter? Will no one help me? I'm sad. I'm scared. I don't want to feel like I have to beg. What if I'm stuck like this? Is this really my life right now? 19 to 26 was a very challenging time. Story 7. I was about 9 years old, and my mom said we were going on a camping trip. I didn't really suspect anything as it was summertime and we went camping a lot when I was younger, although I did wonder why we were packing so much stuff. After a few weeks of camping, I started to complain, but my mom kept insisting it was good for us to get in touch with nature, etc. Then school started and we were still camping. We went camping for another 6 months. When we finally got a house, my mom cried with joy, and we don't camp anymore. Yeah, if there's anything that would end a love for camping, it'd probably be having to live in the woods for a bit, without any other options. Story 8. I was getting high, so it didn't really sink in until I was broke and dope sick. Then the desperation started. Going to gas stations, jumping car to car asking for money, stealing what I had to. It was a miserable existence. There are so many things you don't think about when you're not homeless. taking a shower, washing her clothes, and the boredom. Hours upon hours of nothing to do, and the constant noise. There was nowhere to go where it was truly quiet. Fortunately, I eventually got arrested for shoplifting, reached out to family who helped me to get back on my feet. Shout out to OP's family in this one. I feel like it's easy to turn away a family member who you feel you've lost in some way, like gotten addicted to drugs and then became homeless. But to still show the compassion and love that they deserve as people, it can really help. OP, I hope you're doing better now and you're off the dope. Story 9. When you're a teenager, it seems kinda cool to sleep in the car, on the couch, or a floor with a friend or acquaintance. Or for your dad to scam a rented apartment for a month or two without paying for it. Moving around every few months carrying everything you can in an old Honda Civic seems like an adventure. We once moved a couch across town in it. We must have looked like a couple of idiots. Once, after a few months of staying in a place where we had no furniture, were sleeping on the floor, the carpet of which was so flea-infested you could literally see the fleas hopping around. The landlord got so frustrated with us basically squatting in his property, my dad promised to pay and never did, that he removed the front door. So we went out to scam some food from somewhere and came back to find no front door, which in retrospect is a pretty awesome way to get someone out of your property. One of the ways we scammed food would be to go to the breakfast buffet of a fancy hotel, tell the server we had a room there, eat a ton of food, and just to walk out. This was also kind of fun, but looking back, a kind of screwed up way for a dad to treat his teenage kid. Story 10. I was 13 when my parents kicked me out and told me they no longer wanted anything to do with me. I was terrified to visit a shelter because I'd known some foster kids and the whole system scared me. Plus, I wanted to continue going to the same school. I didn't want to lose my friends, too. The scariest part at that age was really finding out what to eat. There had been a dilapidated trailer just minutes down the road from my dad's place, so I stayed in that. I don't think it really hit me until I had to choose one night between food and blankets, because the temperature was expected to drop down to the mid-30s and I only had one somewhat thin blanket at the time. The next day I put on my best attire, which was nothing impressive, and asked for a job at Long John Silver's. I lied and told them I was 15 and I worked 5 days a week rushing over after school. I ate more unhealthy than I should have since I had to save money for some form of shelter, which came in the form of a 91 Toyota Camry that I purchased out of the thrifty nickel for $300. I loved that clunker, plus heating myself was much easier. From there it was mostly uphill. Found an older lady willing to rent me her garage without any sort of credit check, took a couch off the side of the road to sleep on. I even had internet in there where I mostly read scary stories at night. I wish video streaming services were really a thing back then, and I just kinda learned to roll with the punches. My childhood wasn't normal. It was downright terrifying a good chunk of the time, but it's what made me who I am today. Story 11. I was only homeless for about 6 weeks at 36 years of age. After several years of depression and anxiety slowly eroding my resources, relationships, and general will to try anymore, I ended up having a final blowout with my girlfriend, who reasonably couldn't handle me. I started sleeping at work, which wasn't even a full-time job. The delicacy involved in not getting caught, and the freedom from the extremely unhealthy state my relationship had been in, kept my mind away from the absolute abject terror that was hiding beneath the surface. The scary part of homelessness for me was the growing sense that if I fell any further, I would probably never get back up. It takes resources to be clean, fed, and rested, and if you aren't those things, it's very hard to get resources, let alone find the will to try. But that first night was all triage, all focused on being sure the second night wasn't going to be on the street. I pulled it off for 6 weeks, and that time actually saved my life. I was away from conflict, intimately connected to how dire my circumstances had become, forced into a very regular schedule. Routine is really good for me, but nigh impossible in a depressive state, and without bills, was able to save enough for damage deposit and rent. But the animal terror of having nowhere and no one really seared itself into me. A better motivation would be the future I want than the future I fear, but as it stands, I at least have a motivator strong enough to escape the incredible gravity of mental illness. Now, I don't know the stats on it, but I feel like untreated mental illness has to be pretty high up there in terms of causes of homelessness. And it's hard to even find out if it's a cause, right? On the surface, it looks like someone is not working, can't scrape together enough money for bills, and then loses their place. But underneath that, there can easily be someone like OP, who is just having a lot of trouble managing their own mind, let alone anything else surrounding it. I'm personally a big proponent of mental health is health, and attention to mental health can really prevent situations like this. That all being said, OP, great work. Getting yourself into a half-decent situation out of all of this, it's hard. So well done and good luck. Story 12. My parents didn't tell us that they lost their house to the bank. One day we left everything but a few clothes and essentials. I remember sitting in the car watching the world outside and I felt extremely alone. The drive just endlessly went until we had to go to the bathroom. We ate some cracker things and had water at rest stops from bathrooms. Sleeping in a car seat that you couldn't really lay back in was hard to adapt to, so I didn't sleep for the first couple of nights. It really sucked, but as the days turned into weeks, things became the new normal. We would drive around for hours and sometimes camp out at campgrounds or roadsides instead of sleeping in our woefully tiny car. This completely ruined our education because we couldn't stay at any school long. I loved school for their food, and I would steal paper, pens, and books sometimes so I had something to do. My mother eventually said she would just homeschool us, but that was soon dropped for us kids to do for ourselves. I was able to almost get my GED before sickness stopped me, but some of my younger siblings only have an education from 3rd or 4th grade. When it was winter, I remember having to take showers from those hand pumps at the campground. The water was so cold it would instantly burn and numb up anything it touched. We also didn't have winter clothes, so most of us would wrap up in our old blankets and layers of clothes. We rarely had any food, and I resorted to eating some of my clothes, paper, grass, or tiny pieces of my own skin to try to not feel hungry. Once we had to eat pancakes as our main food for months. I can't eat pancakes anymore because the very smell of them makes me sick now. Other food we got was ramen, and rarely a hot dog. I'm not sure how my parents managed to get the food or have money, even if it was very little. Maybe from a food pantry. Cooking food on the fire wasn't that hard to do, and I learned how to make a fire and gather what a fire needs. If we got sick, we never went to a doctor. Just had to hope it got better. We were on and off homeless until I was in my late teens, and my grandmother bought my parents a house for us all to live in. It feels so strange to actually have a home and even food. I still have a hard time knowing a lot of social norms because of the isolation from homelessness. You just do what you can to survive. I still resent my parents for avoiding any help from the government or going into any homeless shelters. They lost our house because of stupid spending and going into bankruptcy. Their habits never changed. We would get a place to live for maybe a year or two and then lose it because my parents were terrible at managing money. Story 13. I wasn't homeless to the extreme that some other guys I got to know who camped in the woods outside of town were, but I did a spell at a mission in town for a summer. The first night was pretty rough. I'd been living with some friends after losing my place, but life caused them to all go separate ways. So one drove me to the mission and pretty much was like, "Okay, bye." The mission was your typical ultra-conservative Christian ran shelter. The owners were hyper-aggressively masculine, to the point where they demanded your respect even while driving around in their brand new sports cars and treating you like dirt. The guys living there were a mix of ex-cons and drug addicts. But there were also some older gentlemen who were simply there because they were old and the government assistance wasn't enough. You have to adopt new ways of thinking amidst the less reputable side of that crowd. Learn how to keep people from stealing your stuff, and learn how to talk to people who are drugged senseless so they don't start beef with you. I pretty much spent that summer walking around town from dawn to dusk looking for a job. Pretty sure I applied at literally every business I could. Did my best to avoid picking up any addictions. A year later, I'm sitting in a rented house with a lovely girlfriend and a cozy desk job. And I would rather die than go back to that hell. Story 14. I packed 3 bags. One with clothes, blankets, and a pillow. One with food, and one with books. I couch surfed for a bit. A week or 2 with each of my friends. Slept in my car while I had it. I used other people's kitchens to cook stolen food and ate food that 7-Eleven threw away. Every morning at about 6 a.m., night shift would throw out all the food that sat too long. I would wait for the clerk to go back inside and then fish the bag out of the dumpster. Slept outdoors in some parks after the car got towed and I used up my friend's goodwill. Got really good at 5 to 10 minute wash-ups in public bathrooms with hand soap. Teeth, armpits, underboobs, and butt. Let me tell you how nasty hand soap tasted. Would occasionally wash my underwear with hand soap real quick too and dry it with the hand dryers. I would generally use 2 24-hour McDonald's at about 4 a.m. so no one would walk in on me. What I would do is I would panhandle outside of a subway station for enough money for a crack rock, an egg of H, a needle, and a sandwich and tea. If you wear semi-professional clothes and say, "Oh my god, my purse got stolen, does anyone have any spare change?" you get more money than just asking and wearing like jeans. I would then go to the first McDonald's, order the sandwich, and say I had to use the bathroom. Then I would do a wash-up, grab the sandwich, and eat it on the way to the next McDonald's. At the second McDonald's, I would order a tea and ask for lemon juice, pocket the juice, and ask to use the restroom. In the restroom, I would use the juice to break down the crack, mix it with the H, and shoot up. Then, sadly, I would usually actually use the bathroom in a park or something. Did this for years until I accidentally got pregnant. I would be damned if I screwed up my kid by being a junkie, so I cold turkeyed everything. I own a house now and will be 14 years clean on November 18th. This story kind of throws me for a loop because if I'm thinking of, if I had to give advice to someone who is homeless and addicted to drugs, getting pregnant would never even be close to on the list. And yet, here it works for OP. OP, fantastic job. It's incredible that you cleaned up for your future child, and it sounds like now you have a pretty good life if you own a home. But man, if I'm not just bewildered how that worked. You can never really know where the motivation's gonna come from, I guess. Story 15. I lived at school until I dropped out due to a bunch of personal reasons piling up. My mom was mad at me that I dropped out, and wouldn't even talk to me the first days after, and my relationship with my father is complicated/non-existent. I took the train to my hometown, even though I didn't know what I would do or where I would go when I got there. I ended up staying the first night in my brother's room. Not quite an apartment, just one room with a kitchen and bathroom he shares with 5 other people. After that, I posted to social media that I was in this unfortunate situation, and a friend I had lost touch with despite once being very close offered I could stay with him and his fiancée until I got a place of my own. I never actually had to sleep outside, and I found an apartment after about 1 month, so all in all I was pretty lucky. Oh, and my mom and I are cool now. And my dad and I are also trying to rebuild our relationship after he finally divorced his no longer new wife. I've always referred to her as his new wife, even though it's been over a decade. Story 16. I was homeless for a little while in the 80s. It's terrifying at first. You feel so unsafe. I was a teenager and wasn't willing to close my eyes and sleep on a park bench alone, so I went to a local shelter and lied about my age. They forced me to shower and do a pee test. It turns out the women in that shelter were scarier than the street, so the next night I didn't go back. I slept in a park but ultimately made squatter friends and stayed with them. It was very much a community, and I felt safe and loved there. The biggest problem with being homeless in the city is no one wants to let you use the bathroom. Even park bathrooms are locked. Squat peeing in between cars can be done quickly and undercover, but when you get your period, it's a nightmare. These days I have stability, so I never pass a homeless person without buying them some food or giving them a little money. And if they use it for drugs or alcohol, I don't care. Living on the streets is hard. Drink if you need to, my friend. Story 17. I was once fooled by an ex into moving back in with her after a breakup. After a couple of weeks, she decided to have a yard sale, and this yard sale ended up featuring most of my stuff. Then, with the money in hand, she decided it was time I went back to my place. My place, which had nothing in it. My place, which I had given notice on. My place, which was awaiting a new renter. I spent my last 2 weeks sleeping on a hardwood floor using sweaters as blankets, and then when the day came to vacate, I threw all my clothes in a plastic bag and just started walking. I was destitute. I had absolutely nothing and no idea where to start. It was right in the Canadian winter, so staying outside would have been a death sentence. So I did the only thing I could think of. I sat in a 24-hour Tim Hortons. I used what little money I had to purchase small coffees once in a while, so I had an excuse to sit there. Eventually, my cash ran out, and I thought for sure I'd get the boot. Then one of the ladies working the counter came over and just handed me my usual order. I guess she probably figured out what was going on and felt bad. The second time she did it, I struggled not to cry. I'm pretty thankful because my next idea if I was asked to leave was to politely refuse and then sit and wait for the cops. Better than freezing to death after all. Morning came and I had saved only enough to catch a single bus. Headed downtown to try and find some friends, and I did. And I couch surfed between a lot of them. I never spent a night out in the cold, but I spent many in a coffee shop or bouncing between friends. It was the worst my depression ever got, and the closest I ever came to actually taking my own life. Things are a million times better for me now, but I will never forget how worthless I felt. Story 18. The first time I had to live in a motel for half a year. Each night was the same as the last, cramped, upsetting, but dry and safe. The second time I got lucky, and was already staying at my grandparents' house the night when I became homeless again. Thankfully, they allowed me to stay until I eventually got a new home. The first night there was blissful peace and ignorance. Story 19. First thing I realized at 18 when leaving home and finding myself stranded straight away is that I wasn't as unlucky as I had always thought. Female, young, and normal looking. Got support from loads of random people who deemed me very brave. It hit me really hard that if I were fat or a guy, I would have been screwed. I lived in Spain by then, and a couple of nights at the park was quite exciting. Just a couple of nights is what it took to get emergency accommodation, and nobody bothered me. Then jumped from crap job to crap job for a few weeks. Ended up getting a year-long apprenticeship selling shoes. Second, I learned that hitchhiking is pretty cheap and pretty safe in Europe. Just kept clean looks, did loads of workaway placements, and slowly got my feet. I'm 28 now and settling down in Cornwall, UK, which is the nicest place where I could ever imagine living. Story 20. Well, for me, it wasn't due to economic reasons. I was in a new town for work and had my wallet, car keys, and phone in my jacket. Went to a library to loan some books as I had nothing else to do, and I left the jacket unguarded for 10 minutes. Yeah, someone stole it. Had no access to any money, couldn't call almost anyone except my family, and it was 7 p.m. already and getting dark outside. Borrowed a phone and called my girlfriend and then my parents and asked them to contact the company I work for, just to let them know what happened and how they could contact me the next day. So I spent 2 nights without a roof because it took that much time to really sort things out, mostly because I couldn't prove who I was, so I couldn't access the things they helped set me up with. It sucks beyond belief. You can't sleep because it's too freaking cold, and there aren't any places to go either because everything is closed. I remember when McDonald's closed at 10 p.m. the first night, and God, that wasn't fun. But I wasn't hungry at least, as I had dinner before I went to the library. The second day when I was tired as I hadn't slept, I was so cold as well. I thought, we'll sort this through today easily. But boy, was I wrong. It took until 2 p.m. to get in contact with the company, and they really tried to help me. They set up an emergency account at a well-trusted bank, called them in the town I was in, and said explicitly what I looked like, what I was wearing, and that it was an emergency situation. Of course, the bank didn't trust them, so when I went there, they just said, nope. Being really hungry, I borrowed a phone again in the library, called the company, and said what happened. So they mailed me a credit card to the library, talked with some staff at the library to lend me some cash so I could eat until the credit card arrived. So had one more night to spend outside and haven't slept the first night at all. I managed to sleep for about 10 to 30 minutes, and then woke up from the cold and had to start moving to build up some heat in my body, and then I slept a bit again. When McDonald's opened at 7 a.m., I went there and bought breakfast and coffee and asked if I could sleep there for a while. After explaining my situation, they agreed. Slept until 10 a.m., went back to the library and waited for the mail to arrive. Got the credit card and paid the person back with interest. I returned double what she had lent me, because the gratitude you feel when they really freaking saved you from starving just a day is immense. Used the credit card to rent a car in the company's name by having the place who rents out cars call the CEO of the company I work for so he could vouch for it. I drove home and started to get my life back on track. Driver's license, my own bank account, keys, phone, etc. We take these things for granted. Losing them all at the same time was hell. If you ever travel and get to a town you don't know, be very careful about your things, people, so this doesn't happen to you. The only thing I had was my clothes and shoes minus the jacket, but it did harden me. I'm more resilient now. So now I've lived out of a car for 2 weeks, for work, because I couldn't find a cheap place to stay at. And I get 60% of the difference between what they have to pay for my residence in a new town and the actual cost of the residence I choose to stay at. Living out of a car is hard. There are so many things you take for granted that you lack. Running water, toilet, shower, and clean clothes. Just a place to eat that is your own place is something you will miss. If you plan on doing it, get a voltmeter, because I plugged my laptop into the car battery to charge it, then I spent an evening watching YouTube videos and crap, and the next day the battery was dead. Went to a gym for a shower, but had to pay to use it, obviously. Here in Sweden we have no laundromats, so I had to use a dry cleaner to clean my clothes once. The worst part is that the chill really does creep into your car, so try to find a warm garage or a sleeping bag. You have access to none of the things you take for granted. Electricity becomes something you begin to think very carefully about. Always have 2 bottles of water, one for drinking and the other for sanitation. Fill them up before you go back to the car for the night. Keep some toilet paper in the car at all times. It has more uses than merely wiping your butt. Story 21. I'm not sure if this exactly counts as homeless, but it sure felt like it at the time. I'd lived with my partner in his house for 2 years and put up with domestic abuse pretty much from the beginning. I had 2 children from a previous relationship, so it felt like I had to stay, and I should be grateful. One day it got far too much, and I felt that the kids could be in danger. Aged 7 and 3 at the time. So I literally packed 1 change of clothes each, a few pairs of underwear, and a pair of PJs each, and walked out the door when I had less than 30 pounds on me. Having only the clothes on our backs and that 1 bag was the scariest time of my life. I got on a train and went to my closest council office. We sat in that office for nearly 24 hours before they found us a bed and breakfast to stay at for a couple of days. It was about 4 hours away from the kids' school and my only support, my mom. I understand they did it to keep my ex from knowing where I was, but I've never felt so alone. We got moved from one B&B to the next for 9 months. Those 9 months were the hardest of my life, and then we finally got offered a flat to settle down in. I know a lot of people have had worse, but I'll always feel guilty for putting my children through that at such a young age. OP, I know you can't hear me, but I promise, leaving domestic abuse is never something to feel guilty for. Both you and your kids are better for it, and that's not to play down how difficult it was jumping from wherever you had to wherever you had to next. Just because you technically chose homelessness doesn't make it any easier, and really it was a choice you kind of had to make. I don't know if your kids know what you did for them, but if they did, then they would be thankful, I promise you. Story 22. I was actually born homeless. My mom put newborn me into a small laundry basket filled with blankets she'd been gifted. I spent the first year of my life living out of a car with my family. My mom had my 5-year-old brother and 4-year-old sister with her too, all living out of a grand caravan in the early 90s. She'd taken us to Wyoming to hide in the Rocky Mountains, so at least I got to sleep under the stars at night. I've been homeless most of my life. Story 23. Earlier this summer, we spent a month sleeping in my boyfriend's car. It was freeing not to be around people I hate, but I can only say that because I had the luxury of his car with the windows covered at night versus a shelter. It gets very hot though, so we would spend all day up until about 10 or 11 outside of the car, showering at the gym, and going to sleep in the hospital parking garage. He was working then, so we ate a ton of fast food. There were nights where he did sleep at the house and I slept in the car not being welcome, so I begged for a blade for self-defense, thinking I was going to try to take some would-be attacker down with me. We were back on his parents' property now, but in the garage instead of the house. Honestly, though, I still feel like I haven't had a home in the 6 years I've been living here, and my boyfriend hates it too because of the aftermath of the conflict between myself and his brother/brother's girlfriend. I get food and shelter, but I still feel kind of homeless. Story 24. It didn't really occur to me that I was homeless for a couple of weeks. I was 16, and my mom and I were in a domestic abuse situation. She fled to a friend's house, and I fled to my friend's house. I had spent random nights at their house prior in the spare room, but during those 2 weeks I had stayed 3 times with them, and at dinner she gently put down her fork and goes, "Sarah, something is going on. Tell me about it." It wasn't a question, so I started bawling at the dinner table and realized I didn't have a home. And in the next 5 minutes, me, her, my boyfriend, and his dad all had our shoes on and in the car, on our way to the abusive home to grab my things. Then they made the spare room my real room for a year before I could go to university and get an apartment. Although I wish we knew what happened to OP's mother in this situation, it is truly incredible the insane act of kindness from OP's boyfriend's mom. Like, that's a family who already felt that you were part of the family, guaranteed. OP, I'm glad you escaped an abusive environment and found your way into a very loving one, it sounds like. Even if things with the boyfriend didn't work out for whatever reason, I'm sure those people feel like part of your family in some way still. Hope you're doing well. Story 25. I was 18 and had depression. Only had to do the final exams and I would have been good to go. But I panicked and didn't attend, which caused me to fail, of course. Me failing made my depression even worse. My parents couldn't take it anymore, packed my clothes in a case and set me on the street. I had no idea where to go, and didn't want to sleep in the city like most homeless do because I was too afraid of something happening to me or the few things I had while I slept. So I went deep into the woods. I opened the case with my clothes and curled up in there to sleep. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. I was just too disappointed in myself for being such a failure and cried a lot. Thank God I wasn't homeless long before my grandparents took me in until I found a job. When I had a job, my parents took me back in and I went to therapy. I'm good now, but getting abandoned by my parents when I needed them the most still hurts to this day. If I had to guess, it sounds like OP's parents didn't really understand mental illness all that well. Just reading the way OP writes about it now, it sounds like they still think they were a bit of a failure for that. And while I'll never say that not attending your final exams was the right choice, I personally don't think making the wrong choice makes you a failure either. How many times do people make the wrong choices throughout their lives? OP doesn't deserve to feel like a failure of a human being for that. Story 26. My ex-wife made up a bunch of crap to get a restraining order. I got served at work while she simultaneously shut off my phone service and locked me out of our shared bank account. This was January 7th, 2016. I had a t-shirt and slacks to wear for clothes and nowhere to sleep. My car didn't have working heat. Thank God for my parents who got me a hotel, new phone, and some money for clothes. I ended up living in an extended stay hotel for 2 months while I looked for an apartment and got my affairs in order. The restraining order was dismissed, the divorce went to trial, and I got the house and the kids. Story 27. I think people have this idea in their head that homelessness means you're out on the street under a bridge or in a tent, but there are many facets of it. We were homeless for about 10 days after my mom left my dad. I was younger and it didn't click with me until I got older. Mom called me and my sisters and told us to pack up our stuff. We then just did what we needed to for those 10 days until she could secure some housing for us. I remember eating corn and rice for a meal, but that's the only real thing that sticks out to me from that time. Story 28. Honestly, for me, it wasn't too bad. I got kicked out but lived in a good area. I had a car, so I just parked it in parks and stuff, and it was only about 2 weeks before I found a new place to stay. It was also just me at the time, so I really didn't mind too much. Not all cases are like this, though. It was temporary, and I was lucky enough to have a car, as well as a job where I could shower, and I spent most of my days and nights at work. I worked at a kennel and theater, so I generally didn't get off until 2 and was at work by 6. So I wasn't in my car much anyway. It was also the early spring and wasn't too hot and wasn't too cold. I really was lucky. Story 29. My story isn't as rough as some others. I guess I just saw unavoidable homelessness coming about 12 months in advance, and I was able to prepare for it. I basically used all my savings to buy a van and kit it out with the basics: fridge, toilet, etc. It wasn't anything fancy, and by spending that money, I definitely shortened the amount of time I could rent for, but it's been a lot better than just sleeping on the street. The first night after my lease ended and my only home was my van, I went to a spot I'd already cased out. I wanted to be somewhere nice on the first night, just so I might feel like it would be alright. And it was a really great night. It was just me on the beach with no one around for miles. There were so many stars. I woke up just in time to see the sunrise over the ocean. A wild rooster woke me up, and I even found an abandoned camp chair on the beach to sit in. I did really feel like things would be alright then, and the homelessness thing has been good for me. I just feel calmer. Maybe because I'm outside almost all the time. Maybe because I read and write and draw more. Though obviously my experience is a bit better because I have a vehicle and I was prepared. Story 30. The first night it didn't sink in right away the situation I was in. Kind of in a daze of get crap to a storage unit, what do I need, what do I throw out? About 5 days in it to set in. I was never directly on the streets, but I did some couch surfing stints and slept in my car. Having your own room and place to just zone out and be by yourself is a luxury I will never give up again. The real kicker of it all is the getting back to where you were before, but it also puts a lot of crap in perspective of wants versus needs. I was also between jobs, which is a whole other hurdle to jump over. Went from mildly inconvenienced to, oh crap, this is for real. It makes you grow up quick if you want to get out of the situation. I slipped for a few months having pity parties. Luckily, one of my ex-buddies helped me by booting me out the door. Crap is awkward because I still feel like I owe him, and crap got real between us while I was real deep down depressed. It's not easy pulling yourself out of that rut, but he gave me the kick in the butt I needed, and while we're not real close friends anymore, I don't resent what happened, and I still wish I could at least make it up monetarily for all the things he did for me, even though it was never expected. Luckily, I didn't have anyone besides me to worry about. I didn't want my family to know, but they've since pieced it together. I can't imagine how difficult it's gotta be with a kid. I would never wish homelessness on my worst enemy. Story 31. Absolutely sucked and still does. I slept in a shopping mall that happened to be open all night. The night I was able to get in supported housing that is shared with other people. The next day I was able to get in supported housing that is shared with other people. Fortunately, my phone is paid off and I have unlimited data, so that gives me something to do, as I was big into gaming before all the crap happened. I'm currently living on 1 bowl of oats a day until next week when hopefully I receive some government help. I don't take drugs or drink alcohol and I have no possessions to sell for food. The thought of eating something such as a pizza or a roast dinner, sounds so amazing. But it's so far away that I try not to think about it. I spend my time watching streamers and browsing Reddit. You would not believe the amount of reposts when you spend so much time on here. Story 32. I was in my early 20s dealing with undiagnosed mental illnesses and a family with whom I had worn out my welcome. At the time, I was barely treading water as a human being. I could get up, bathe, and feed myself, but the prospect of getting out of the house and trying to support myself seemed daunting, if not outright impossible. Anyway, to keep a very long story as short as possible, one day it all came to a head, and with as many worldly possessions as I could cram into a hiking backpack, clothing mainly, my mom and brother drove me to the nearest train station and bought me a one-way ticket to the nearby major city. My goal at the time was to visit one of the many world-renowned hospitals in the city and see what they could do for me. Only, I wasn't that capable at the time and things weren't that simple. The first day I just wandered around the city, which I was only semi-familiar with. As the sun set and day turned to night, I relied on instinct. Sleep somewhere well lit, and keep my few meager possessions safe. In a large and well-attended public square, I curled up near a pillar with my backpack for a pillow and tried to get some sleep. It wasn't easy, of course. Local security guards didn't like me sleeping there, nor did more veteran homeless people whose spots I was inadvertently challenging them for. I barely got 2 hours of sleep before the sun was rising again, and I was starting to get hungry. Priorities were hard to balance. I was hungry, I was confused, I was fuzzy from lack of sleep, and things only compounded from there. I did stop in at the major hospitals trying to plead my case, but there were people worse off than me. I was still capable, still mentally well-arranged enough to eloquently present my case, which ironically meant to many doctors I wasn't sick enough to warrant helping. I spent 6 months homeless, the first month or so sleeping outside, before finally securing a bed in a gymnasium-like shelter which housed 30 of us, all in the same large room, and with a footlocker for storage. I stayed there for another couple of months, before through titanic effort I secured a job at a fast food joint, which also earned me a spot in a more exclusive shelter, one for the working homeless, which meant I only had to share a room with 7 guys now. I was there for another 5 months before my world collapsed. I couldn't keep up with the paltry demands on my shoulders. I wasn't healthy, and I ignored addressing my problems in lieu of working as much as I could because nothing was more precious to me by now than food, security, and the right to stay in my exclusive home. I wandered the streets in a daze. Doctors would later refer to it as a fugue state, which isn't something you see very often, but I was finally sick enough to warrant treatment. My battle with mental illness and journey through that system is a story for another time, but suffice it to say there were a lot more bumps in the road ahead of me. I'm in my 30s now and I'm doing a lot better, I'm happy to report. I'm receiving proper treatment for my illnesses and I've largely conquered them. I'm in my own place, typing this on a PC that I purchased myself. It's a chilly Monday morning, and I'm drinking coffee and looking out the window at the beautiful world outside. I'm very fortunate, and I am content. Story 33. I was homeless about a year or two, and it was bad. Although the reason I left was because I was being abused by my father, so I guess you could say it was sort of better. As everyone says, the first night is bad. Bad, bad. You come to the conclusion that this is really happening. There was actually a shelter that took me about 5 hours to walk to. I had no idea what huge difference a car would make, but I'm going to give advice. Don't bother going to a shelter. Maybe it was because I went from one lifestyle to another in a day, but the people there are rowdy, they smell, they steal your stuff, and fights have broken out more than once. I lasted 3 days before I left and decided to leave. I found a secluded spot in a parking lot that wasn't too bad to sleep in, and probably for the whole time except for when I went long distances away from the area, I would sleep there. It was shaded from the sun, didn't get too stuffy, it was spring to summer, and again, pretty hard to find. At least I've never seen anyone sleep there. I brought my phone with me when I left, and when I went to a Starbucks or a library or whatever else, I would get on Wi-Fi and watch YouTube or anything I was feeling at the time. That's actually how I found Reddit. I lurked for a while before I ever started posting. I would visit libraries and search for jobs online. Thank God they let anyone use the computers. After I got a job, it took a few more months, but I rented a small apartment and then applied for school. I'm on scholarship right now. Technically full ride if you count the 3 others. I've been living in the dorms, but I'm getting ready to move in with a friend. So, what's being homeless like? It's so freaking hard. It makes you want to cry. I've had moments where I thought I would be better off dead since both lives, with family and homeless, were failing. I never want to go back to that time. I'm going to treat my kids right so they never have to go through that, or feel like they have to make that decision for themselves. I kinda went off on a tangent, so sorry if I ended up saying more than what the question asked. Nobody else in my life knows about me being homeless, so I'm extremely grateful for Reddit letting me express myself. Story 34. My first day of being homeless, I had to bring my son and parents to the airport. I had to make sure my son would be well, so I decided to let him live with my parents, who came to pick him up. It was awful, but I also timed it so I wouldn't feel the awfulness of being split from my son. I went surfing the same day and stayed out of town with a friend. After the short surf trip, I was truly homeless and temporarily childless. I messaged a friend to let me stay the night, the first of many. I also arranged to stay with another friend and her family. It was July. I only had summer clothes. I needed to be able to get my crap together before it got colder. So maybe I wasn't out on the streets, but I still had no permanent home. Not as bad as others posted here. Story 35. Months of depression led me to travel with no money. I got to a really big city by train. First month I stayed at a dude's house in which he wasn't living. Then I thought it was a little too much and decided to go to the streets, where I already had made some friends who already were living in the streets. The first night was weird. At some point, all these wandering souls gathered beside a train station, and everyone started sharing the food they've got during the day. We ended up cooking a fondue inside a big tomato can. It was the first time I tried fondue. Then it was 2 months of a routine. Sleep there, wake up with the sun, wash myself and the clothes in a river, and go with a friend to do stunts in a stoplight. The last night before deciding to go back to my hometown, a group of neo-Nazis attacked us. Now I have a 1-inch scar on the left side of my skull. I'm alright now, father of 2, in love with my wife and with my own house in the woods. Story 36. I was young, 11 years old, but I was aware my mom was on drugs and that my situation was going where it ended up. It started out with moving a lot, state to state, wherever the cheapest place to live was. The living conditions got worse with each move. In our last house as a family before we got taken away by CPS, we had to clean it out before moving in. Some deal my mom made with the landlord. It was disgusting, full of mouse crap, dirty needles, adult magazines, and the floor was completely covered in garbage. Oh well, I thought, at least it's a house. I was excited for a new place to live. Then the gas got shut off, and then the electricity in the middle of winter. My mom's car got the windshield busted out of it and we used plastic wrap to fix it. The cops would knock on our door and we'd do as we were trained. Hide under the beds, don't answer, don't make a sound. Once the utilities were out, I knew we'd be moving again. We stayed in a homeless shelter for a short while until school started back up. I was in middle school for less than 2 months before, in the middle of the night as usual, my mom said to pack up our things and saying we would be moving the next night. But I didn't realize how bad on drugs she was, not fully. Not until we arrived in Death Valley and slept outside of a church. Desert nights are very cold, and the days are very miserable when you live outside. I just accepted it. I felt my 11-year-old heart grow cold, like a candle was blown out in me. My mom didn't enroll us in school. We got MRSA, a flesh-eating disease, yum, and got no medical treatment. We weren't fed, so we would steal food from stores and ask restaurants for free samples. I met 2 strangers who cared and bought us food. It was embarrassing. I felt unworthy. Being homeless made me feel a little less human than everyone around me. I could go on about the experience, but this comment is long enough as it is. I think hearing about the stories with children who are homeless hurt just a little bit more than the others, because at that point in their lives, there truly is nothing they could have done to change it. They just simply didn't have that level of agency. OP didn't talk much about how they are now, but I can only hope that they're doing much better and have managed to stumble their way through life and end up with something good. At the very least, OP, I hope you're happier. And no flesh-eating disease, ideally. Story 37. Slept in the backseat of my friend's broken down Volkswagen Beetle. Used the light from the streetlight to study and get my homework done on time. Later on, that same friend would sneak me into his dad's camper at night so I could actually lay out flat and get a good night's sleep. That worked for a while until I got caught and his dad kicked us both out. Went back to sleeping in the bug. Got by using old airline toiletries and washing up in public restrooms by the beach and nearby Burger King. Still made the dean's list, though. Story 39. I grew up in foster care, and then when you become an adult, you age out, meaning you are no longer in the system. Some kids who age out are allowed to stay with their foster parents if they have a good relationship. I didn't have a good relationship with my foster parents. They had a mix of foster children and their own biological children living in the house, and they basically just did it for the check. Anyway, I knew my birthday was approaching and that I'd have to leave, and I was really nervous to talk to my foster mom about it. I did, and she was pretty dismissive of me, saying that there wouldn't be room, but that maybe I could stay for a few weeks after my birthday. A few days after my birthday, however, the caseworker shows up and I have to go. I signed a bunch of paperwork and other stuff. They watched me as I packed my stuff. The crappy part was that I didn't have much stuff because I shared a room. Plus, I had lived in multiple homes and never had more than one duffel bag. I asked to take a small blanket that I had had since I had been there, but my foster mom said no because it had been in their family for years. I got a little money from my caseworker, not a lot. Then she escorted me out. Like, this woman just walked me out and down the block. My first night was okay, actually. I slept in the park, but it was pretty cold at the time because it was November, but I got used to it. Honestly, at the time, it felt like I was free. I had always lived with crappy people in crappy homes where I had no privacy or a billion chores to do or just getting yelled at. Out on the streets, no one bothered me much unless I was begging for money off of people. Of course, in my homeless years, I didn't make the best decisions. Lots of guys used me or took advantage of me, and there were times when it was super rough and I didn't know if I would make it. But at least I was in charge of myself, if that makes sense. Also, and this is random, homeless people often get asked why we stay out on the street and don't go to a shelter. FYI, they fill up fast and run out of room, and they can be dangerous. I've known a few people who have been assaulted there. I'm not saying all are bad, but in my experience, not exactly a safe place. I have a home now, but sometimes I set newspapers on top of my sheets and sleep on them. I know how bizarre that sounds, but there were nights when I was out on the streets and had nothing, but I would find a whole stack of newspapers. I'd be so happy I'd wrap up in them and feel warm and safe. Story 40. I was 17. I hit a car with my dad's Corvette. It wasn't that big of a deal, just a little damage to the front. Well, the guy I hit called my dad before I got home and told him a bunch of BS. Said his bumper fell off his car and read my dad the riot act. When I got home, I walked through the front door. My dad hit me in the chest and knocked me back through the doorway. He screamed at me and told me to get out of his life. I went to the Redondo Beach pier where I hung out and started sleeping under the pier. The first night and most nights after were a series of moments of having no idea what to do. I was lost. After 7 months, I called my maternal grandparents and asked them for help. They moved me back to Arizona and got me into college. I gotta be honest, OP, that doesn't sound like a good father whatsoever. Like, I promise, parents can get upset about things without punching their kids in the chest and telling them to get out of their lives. Even if you had absolutely totaled his car, I just see no excuse for this kind of reaction. I'm glad your grandparents were there for you, OP. Story 41. I lived in a minivan for half a year while I worked full-time at an airport. The trick was to not actually leave when the shift ended, or if I left I wouldn't go super far. I could afford to eat a couple times a day and I had a cheap gym membership so I could shower. The boredom was mind-numbing, but if it got too bad I would just go back to the airport and people watch or pretend like I was about to fly somewhere. Never missed my family so much. Eventually gave up and moved back home. Story 42. Moved to a new city and didn't have an advance to pay enough for hotels. Couldn't find a place to accept my rent application, so homeless. Had just enough to eat, but waiting on that paycheck hurt. First few nights weren't too bad. I knew a few places I could crash for one night and no one would comment. Dorm common rooms, university 24-hour computer labs, a church rec room I knew to always be unlocked. I never used any place more than once if I could avoid it to keep from being suspected as being homeless instead of just some random who came for a party and crashed out. But as things went on and I still couldn't get an apartment in the new city, the dread of the evening really started to settle in and get loud. Started relying on the only place I knew to be my own, my car. But it was cold and uncomfortable, and while parking in shelter and safe places isn't as hard as finding safe places to sleep outside a car, it is still hard. Too public and you risk attention. Too private and you risk being unable to reach help or trespassing. Story 43. I'm currently homeless, have been for about 4 months. The one emotion that stands out amongst the rest is anxiety. Constant, chronic, crippling anxiety. I've worked full-time since before I lost my housing, so I have minimum basics covered, but I'm terrified I'll never get ahead enough to move back indoors. It's constantly waiting for the next thing to go wrong, /break, /get stolen. I know it's healthier to buy supermarket food, but I can only afford dollar store canned goods, and have nowhere to cook anyway. It's being uncomfortable anytime you're home. It's shame and self-hatred for letting it get this far. It's isolation because you're too embarrassed to tell all your well-off friends you failed at one of the most basic human needs. It's mind-boggling how I have never had a drug or alcohol issue, but I'm now living right alongside those who do. All this because I couldn't work while I was in the hospital and have zero support system in my life to go for help. It's dehumanizing and I'm ashamed of myself, to be honest. Story 44. I was 20 at the time and it was the dead of winter. My first night was lots of, why does no one care? Where will I sleep? How will I eat? God, it's cold. Why me? Is this the end? The first night I walked to each one of my friends' houses and eventually found one with their car unlocked. I slept in the backseat of their Honda and made sure to set an alarm on my watch to wake up before they left for work. It was shady, but to this day I'm grateful they left their car unlocked. A week or so later I called family to see if I could spend Christmas with them, and it was a resounding no from all parties. I cried a lot. It really broke me. That situation lasted a little over a month. It pressured me to get clean off the drugs I was using. I was confident that I would die or take my own life if I had to live that way for any longer. Been clean for 7 years now. Being homeless humbled me. I'm no longer the arrogant, selfish jerk that put himself in that situation. Story 45. I was 17, a week after I graduated high school. My adoptive mother kicked me out. She was mentally and physically abusive, and a massive opioid addiction didn't help. Well, all I had was a social security card and what I could carry. Couldn't get an ID until she thankfully died because she knew I would find out I was adopted as soon as she gave me the BS birth certificate that was just a printout on a very old piece of paper that didn't even have a raised seal on it. No, I don't know how that even worked, but I imagine she was just too lazy to go get a new one after she got the one the state sent her after my adoption. Mind you, I was 19 when I was officially told. Despite constantly questioning why I look nothing like my parents, I was ecstatic to leave. Living on the streets, I had the best time of my life compared to the battlefield that was my adoptive mother. I've always had to survive in my own way, so surviving in the streets took a lot of creativity I already had. I slept in a local park bathroom that oddly had heat and air, and not once did I beg for money on a corner or stay in a mission. To this day, I have hip and knee problems thanks to going from locked in my room unless I was at school to walking hundreds of miles. I was ecstatic, had the time of my life, and survived by living in a park bathroom. My adoptive mother with a pill addiction wanted a baby, and not a child to raise, so she got rid of me as soon as she could. Story 46. I've been homeless twice, but both times I managed to secure a temporary place to sleep after a couple of days. Those first days, though, were among the worst I've ever experienced. It's just a sense of panic and feeling exposed and unsafe. Every time you go inside, you tell yourself to enjoy it for as long as they'll let you because it's raining and windy outside and you know you'll soon be back out in it. I have no doubt that if I had to do it for longer in either instance, I probably wouldn't have survived it, one way or the other. So I can't answer to the adapting to it part, but thought I would share what I know anyway. Story 47. So someone woke me up and asked if I was okay in the morning, and I explained the situation. Then they told me to leave since it was private property and there would be people there soon, and they didn't want me making the place look bad. As soon as the words left his mouth, I realized I was already viewed as less than human after one night. I ended up going to work still, as I never told them I was kicked out of my home, and showering at the local community college since they never checked to see if people using the gym were students. Eventually, I got back on my feet, and even now that I'm not homeless, I still feel that way inside often, like I'm less than human. Story 48. It was quite brief. I lived with my grandmother until she died, just after I turned 18. The building society, like a bank, had refused to let me have anything to do with her house and opted to evict me. The last week was madness trying to get all my stuff out. I gave loads away to different people. I had a tiny flat lined up, but that was taking longer than expected and the eviction date loomed. The bailiffs wouldn't extend further, so they came, took my keys, and that was it. I was homeless, albeit briefly, but I had a set of spare keys, so I just let myself in and slept in a sleeping bag on the floor with our dog until the flat was ready, with everything I could squeeze into my car in there. The rest of my stuff was tipped, but that's life sometimes. I did go through a period of being of no fixed abode for a while, a year or so later, as I screwed up on the flat, and had no idea how to manage my money properly. Eventually got that sorted out too, but it's a garbage lifestyle. Story 49. I was homeless as a kid, but my mom always found a friend I could stay with or a hotel. Some roof. Then I hit 18 and went through some legal stuff. Lost the apartment I was in, but my buddy still got me a place to stay. I'm doing very well in my life right now, and I show incredible loyalty to those who showed it to me. Very blessed and thankful. Those public breakfasts for kids at school in the morning, those things gave kids with no stability something to look forward to. Food was warm, milk was cold. I'm going to cry because yesterday I turned 30. I went skydiving and had delicious food, and I haven't struggled in 8 years, and I'm just so grateful for everyone's help, ever. Thank everyone with kindness in their hearts. Story 50. It was surreal. I was at one of my lower points, freshly 21, and I met a bunch of people that traveled with Renaissance festivals. So when my lease was up and I didn't find a new apartment, I went to the campground where all these vagabonds were staying and ended up staying in a guy's doghouse next to his tent. He constructed it out of tarps and scrap wood. And yes, I stayed in there with his dogs. Overall, the night was good, as I still had my Adderall and money for liquor. I ended up traveling with those people for a few years, working rent fairs, partying, and seeing the different parts of the US, just being completely free. Story 51. My experience may kind of differ, and it was actually recently that I was homeless. I was in a rough financial situation, so I used the last bit of money on a tent, a lock, some food, and a bunch of plastic bottles of vodka. I worked a kitchen job with a woodsy area next to it and set up my tent out there. I would basically just hang around the woods, screwing off, climbing trees, and trying to build various things until I had to work. Went to work, came back to the tent, put a lock on the zippers, and drink myself to sleep watching YouTube. I would charge my phone at work. I had a Planet Fitness membership since it was $15 a month. Went to the gym to shower and all that. After a couple months, I'd saved up enough for a place in a new state. Story 52. I was technically homeless for a month this year. I planned for the end of my lease poorly this summer and didn't have a place lined up right after. I still had my job. I packed all of my things into a storage locker, bought a plywood board and a cheap twin mattress to put in the back of my Suburban and some curtains. It was the summer, so the worst part was a little heat. I basically had a month-long camping trip at a campground just outside of town, where I paid $75 a week for a tent spot and use of the showers. All in all, a bit uncomfortable, but I made it out alive. I also got to see some beautiful thunderstorms, and I went and took lots of pictures of nature on my days off from work. and I got to pet the cats that lived on the campground. Story 53. October 2004. I did a moonlight flit to get away from my husband who had threatened to murder me yet again. Although this was a semi-regular occurrence, this time was different, and I was truly afraid for my life. The first few nights were spent in a friend's caravan, but my 3 children saw it as an adventure holiday and were happy. But then I contacted the local council and found they didn't have provisions in their budget for victims of domestic violence. I searched further afield and was lucky to be offered a place. We stayed in the first place a couple of weeks, but it was set up so that we felt too exposed. We had to park away from the property and walk along the main road in a town, ring the bell, and wait for a member of staff to open the door to let us in. A stranger was taking photos of the children on the beach and he disappeared when I approached him. Later I found out that he was a police photographer, sent because my violent husband had alerted the police saying that the children were at risk. The police disagreed. They told the children's father that the children were safe and happy, but not where they were. After that, we found another place that was purpose-built and was less exposed. But none of us were happy there. When the children told me how much they hated it, we moved on again, and were offered a third refuge that the children liked so much they wanted to stay there forever. The following week, a new resident arrived, and life changed. More new residents arrived until we had been there longer than the others. One resident wanted to be number 1 and started a hate campaign against me. No matter what I did made life worse. But it wasn't exposed till the house meeting. After the meeting, the staff apologized to me as I had raised concerns that they had ignored. I was offered a refuge house for just me and my children, and we were there for nearly 3 months before the council offered us a property of our own. I don't know where you live, OP, but I gotta say the infrastructure for people in situations like yours doesn't sound too bad. Like, does it sound perfect? No. But you weren't just tossed out on the street and forgotten about. And I feel like domestic violence isn't taken super seriously in some places, especially by the police. So, shout out to everyone involved there. Story 54. Still homeless, but about 6 months out from getting back up. First night, I had gotten off the bus in Southern California and found some little spot in an alley where I could sleep. I had my backpack with 2 outfits, a sleeping bag, and some hygiene stuff. At some point of the night, a guy walked through, saw me, and stopped to talk. You could tell he was on some hard drugs. It's a giant issue here. And he was talking about how he sees demons and angels and he's taking part in a holy war. He then at some point told me how I was really wise and my aura was that of a leader, and he hopes he could lead his team in the fight against Satan. He then went a little ways down and went to sleep. Maybe an hour or so later, I awakened to the sound of another homeless guy yelling at this holy war warrior, saying that he was going to mug him or murder him. I just silently scooped up all my stuff and walked away quickly. Later, I found a much safer spot to sleep in, but the first few days was nothing but processing. Just thinking about the fact I had no home, and also where to find the resources for food, water, bathroom, etc. Few months now, and while the drug addicts and shady people are still a concern, I've adapted and learned how to take care of myself. I shower daily, do laundry every few days, and keep myself kept up. Being homeless is expensive and extremely tiring. Story 55. We were extremely lucky that we were homeless in New York City. They put us in a temporary shelter our first night, but we got there so late that we only had about 5 hours to sleep. It was me, my husband, and our 1-year-old daughter. The next day, they had our placement. What happens is you get to stay there for 10 days while the city decides if you actually need this assistance. You have to prove that you can't stay with relatives and don't have enough money to move out of state. The city will actually buy you plane tickets to another state if you have relatives willing to take you in. So after our 10 days, we were told we could stay in the shelter. Our place was a converted hotel near JFK. They had a playground outside for the kids, and we had our own bathroom and a small kitchenette to cook meals. We wound up being there for 6 months. During that time, we took advantage of not having to worry about bills to go to all the doctor's appointments we needed to do for our disability cases. My husband had been in a work accident and had a severe spinal cord injury. In the shelter, he needed a walker. I was born with an autoimmune disease and had a flare-up shortly after my daughter was born, but it didn't go away. So the doctors documented how I got worse and worse, and figured that was it for me. I wasn't going to be able to work ever again and was probably going to wind up in a wheelchair. I was bedridden on and off. Honestly, we were happy to have a roof over our heads. We were optimistic that the city would be able to get us permanent housing and that we would finally get as healthy as we could be and find our new normal. However, after our 6 months, they realized my husband's lawsuit was going to take ages. They were hoping that we could get money from it right away to buy a co-op or a condo, so they told us they couldn't help us find housing. We had to make a very difficult decision to split our family up temporarily. My husband went back to his mom in San Fran, and I went back to my parents who now live in Florida. In August 2018, he took a settlement, and we'd been back together for a year until August 2019, when he passed away. It sucks that part of my memory of him is being homeless, but we were together as a family then, and that's all that matters. OP, to start the story saying you were extremely lucky and then ending it with your husband passing away, I don't know, I just wasn't prepared for it. Just an absolute gut punch of a story. I'm sorry, OP, that you had to, for any time, split up your family. It sounds like there was and is nothing but the greatest amounts of love you could possibly imagine between you. I'm sorry for your loss. Story 56. I was kicked out of my house a few months after coming back home from college. Winter during Michigan. I worked during the day, so at least I could stay warm during then. I worked at a movie theater at the time, so I would just stay after and watch some movies. At close, I would go out to my car and find a church parking lot to sleep in. I was pretty broke at the time, so I couldn't afford to keep my car running at all times. The nights were the absolute worst parts. I threw on as many layers as could possibly fit on me and tried to sleep. I was only on the streets for about a week, but I imagine I averaged only about 3 hours of sleep per night. It's the anxiety of someone finding you, the cold, and not knowing what's to come next that keeps you up. All I could do was think, and it started to drive me a little crazy. I was fortunate enough to have friends that eventually let me sleep on their couch for a few months until I got back on my feet. It honestly could have been a lot worse. It wasn't that bad, but near the end of the week of actually being homeless, I was so sleep deprived and was definitely losing it a bit. Kids, live by your parents' rules when you live in their house. Story 57. Fresh out of the military with wife and baby. Got a decent job that allowed me to rent a nice apartment for my family, but having no experience, I lost it. The only other job that was hiring was a job installing car phones. Rent was beyond my ability now, even with the WIC and food stamps. And after getting evicted, started sleeping in my car in the parking lot to my new job. After a couple of days in, my boss realized what was going on and made arrangements for us to stay in a Salvation Army family shelter. They provided me the ability to stay for a whole month in their shelter. After that, they provided me an apartment for 6 months and charged me rent. At the end of the 6 months, they gave me back the rent I paid them so I can pay the costs of getting a new place. Security deposit, first and last month, and some baby furnishings. 1 year later, I found out my wife was cheating on me, and when I confronted her, she left me. I ended up moving back home with my son, and my family helped raise him. She never reached out. Today I have a great paying job thanks to my military technical training, an amazing wife, 25 years together, am a homeowner, and my son is a college graduate. I am so grateful for the helping hand I received from the Salvation Army, and have no shame in saying so. I truly believe that people don't deserve to feel shame for ever reaching out to one of these services. They're there to be used by people who need them. The only time you should feel ashamed is if you're abusing them somehow. OP, screw your ex-wife. Going through all that just to find out she's cheating on you? Piece of garbage. I am so glad that you're in a loving, happy relationship now, and that your son turned out so well. Anyway, that was the last story we have for today. This was a little bit of a heavier one, I know, but there were some uplifting stories in here too, which is always nice to balance it out. In fact, most of them ended up somewhat uplifting. Just as a quick closing note, I feel like I want to say it's important to remember that homeless people are absolutely still people. Unless you ask them or they talk about it, there's no way to know why they ended up homeless. I would encourage reserving judgments and showing compassion. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.